it's long been true, really, frankly, ever since the Liz Truss regime, that many Conservative voters are now switching to Labour. And even though some Conservative MPs still want to deny it. But equally, there are now as many people who voted Conservative in 2019 who are saying they're going to vote for reform. And that 50-50 split is what we also seem to see in the results in the two by-elections. So Labour, so in the end, I think one would say to you that the discontent with the Conservatives is greater than the enthusiasm for Labour.
And it isn't travelling in just one direction.
But of course, the discontent with the Conservatives is quite substantial indeed.
Yeah, and the Reform Party, they're doing two things really, aren't they? They are splitting the Conservative vote, but they're possibly, depending on how things go in a general election, getting in the way of a Labour majority, or the kind of majority Labour would like to have, perhaps.
No, I don't think that's how I would read it at the moment.
No?
Most of the people,
too soon.
Well, most of the people who are switching from Conservative to Reform, most people who are voting for Reform are former 2019 Conservative voters. They are people who voted for Leave back in 2016, and to that extent, at least, they look much more like Conservative voters than Labour voters. Now, there's an interesting question about, would all of them still be would all of them be voting Conservative if Reform wasn't on the ballot paper? Now, the answer to that is probably no, and maybe at the edges, they are taking some people that otherwise Labour might have managed to pick up. But when it comes to seats, I think the truth is, insofar as one reckons that Reform are at least in part reaching parts of the former Conservative electorate that Labour would not be able to reach despite Sir Keir's best endeavours, and given that Reform are unlikely themselves to win any seats, the truth is the net effect of all of this is likely to mean that the Conservatives will lose more seats than would otherwise be the case, and Sir Keir have a bigger majority. And that undoubtedly is the fear that Conservative MPs have about the rise of Reform. And certainly now, the Conservatives face a fight on two fronts. They're no longer just fighting Labour. They're also having to fight the Conservatives. And if you're trying to fight two enemies who have two rather different characteristics, that becomes quite a difficult battle to engage in.
Because you can't have a cohesive message necessarily in a general election campaign.
Indeed, well, it certainly might be difficult to appeal to both groups.
It probably isn't the death of the Conservative Party, and I would agree that what happened last night I don't think is the start of the death of the Conservative Party. It's very well established infrastructure. It might well lose, and it could well lose big in a general election, but never write them off. There is an infrastructure there. It's I think the oldest political party in the world. And it still has many, many supporters, many of whom are quiet. I mean,
it's been, just to add to what you're saying there, it's been the most successful for decades and decades and decades and decades. In terms of getting into power, people might regard what they do when they're in power as not successful for them, but
exactly,
you do have to wonder what happens next.
Yeah, you do. I mean, let me talk about my position. I was a Conservative councillor until 2016. I was also an election agent in 2010, the general election, in a battleground seat. So, I have a Conservative background. I think most of my life I've probably voted Conservative, not always, but most of the time. I did, in fact, stand to be an MP as an independent in 2005 because of my frustration with what was happening with politics. But fundamentally, I am a Conservative, and I've been very annoyed to see how the massive majority in 2019 has been thrown away. And I'm very, very annoyed by that.
It really has been. It really has been.
I've never seen anything like it. I mean...
Who threw it away, or what lost it?
I just think when you get massive majorities, minorities within that party suddenly think they've got a lot of power. And they can carry on regardless, doing whatever they want. I just think it wasn't a well-managed party with that majority. You need to keep people in order, and people just get carried away with their own importance and power, and that's why that majority sometimes isn't a good thing to have, because people can just get carried away. You've got these so-called five families, and they're all going off at a tangent. Divided parties do not win elections, and I'm shocked that people in politics haven't learnt that lesson, don't realise. They only have to look at what's happened to the Labour Party over the last few decades, when they've been not a united party, and how badly they've lost. So, for me, getting rid of Boris Johnson in the way that they did, then having Liz Truss, she didn't last for 49 days, I think it was, if my memory serves me correctly, then coming up with Rishi Sunak, who people virtually immediately he became the Prime Minister, there were actions being taken against him to undermine his position.
It's all felt very shaky for a long time, hasn't it? Paul, thank you very much indeed for your call. And if we go back to the Cameron reforms of the party, for example, some of which have stuck and become just, a given now in society. Think of, same-sex marriage, for example, and other things. But have we seen since then a kind of back and forth from those reforms from within the party, where people thought, great, it's got us into power, because some of them did get them into power. But then once you got that stonking majority from Boris Johnson, they almost started to flex their more right-wing muscles again.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think many people in the Conservative Party were prepared, if you like, to put up with David Cameron's more liberal style of conservatism, because they liked his economic policies. They were completely happy with austerity, even if they didn't like some of the more socially liberal stuff. But once he'd gone, I think they found that Brexit and the electoral coalition they were able to build as a result of Brexit in 2019 gave them the opportunity to, as you say, flex their more right-wing instincts. Now, that's not true of the whole of the Conservative Party by any stretch of the imagination, but it is true of a fairly vocal minority of its MPs, and it's probably true of many, if not a majority, of its grassroots members. So, I mean, the Conservative Party is a coalition, like all our parties under first past the post. But I think it's definitely true that in recent years, we've seen the more right-wing side of that coalition assume a degree of dominance in the party that perhaps wasn't the case under David Cameron.
Often when a party suffers a severe defeat, we've seen it with Labour in previous years as well, and the Tories in previous years, when they suffer severe defeat, they go off and they re-examine themselves, their policies, their approach. And if, as looks to be the case, they're going to be defeated, the Conservatives are going to be defeated in the general election, is it just more of that they will face? Or do they have more bearing down on them from the right of the, from the political right in the country? Do they have more bearing down on them this time than perhaps the Oliver Letwin era, when he went off and led that policy review?
Well, I think you're right to point to pressure from the right, and a lot of it, of course, comes not just from within the Conservative Party, but from without. And this is where I think the role of UKIP, the Brexit Party, and Reform is extremely important, because one of the reasons the Conservative Party has moved towards this more populist radical right kind of politics is partly because they are so worried about losing supporters to the right-wing insurgency on their flank. I think if Reform UK continues to do well and does well, for example, at the 2024 election, then that may well put more pressure on the Conservative Party to move even further in that direction, just as the fact that UKIP did very well and the Brexit Party did very well moved the Conservative Party in that direction a few years ago.